ACC Nation Football Preview with our special guest, the publisher writer for Rivals and Yahoo Sports Networks, covering Georgia Tech, Kelly Quinlan. Thanks, Kelly, for joining us and talking about the Yellow Jackets.
No problem. Happy to come on.
No way are we giving away state secrets. You know, the juiciest of rumors to start this Yellow Jackets preview. We're going to hold off as long as possible to forgive the pun. Key you in on the promise this offense holds. Kelly, let's share how much the transfer portal will impact this year's team, and then look at how effective this coaching staff has been thus far with recruiting.
Yeah, so, with the portal, I think the big positions of need were obviously needed another quarterback. So they got Haynes King and Zach Powern, and Haynes King will battle out at quarterback. They had a Dominique Blaylock at wide receiver, Abdul Janae from Duquesne, and Chase Lane from Texas A&M, and Christian Leary from Alabama. So they had quite a few bodies there on the offensive side. They had a tight end from Georgia and Brett Seether, and a guard from Princeton that's a multi-year starter. Defensively, they added a whole bunch of guys, particularly linebacker. They added 3 new linebackers to replace Charlie Thomas and Aida Ely, who were both all ACC guys. They have Andre White from Texas A&M, Braylon Oliver from Minnesota, and Paul Miola, who's from Idaho via Notre Dame. He started his career at Notre Dame, had an Achilles injury there, and then went to Idaho and was all FCS. I don't know what conference they're in, but these days, whatever that conference was, he did a great job. So they've added guys there. Yeah, some out west. And they've added a few other, backup pieces and some depth guys at defensive end. And, they did a nice job of sort of mixing that up, but also Brent Key wants to build the program organically. So they focused in on signing a decent sized high school class, and that's going to be sort of the foundation of what he does there.
I'm pretty excited based upon everything that I've been reading about how effective they have been in using the transfer portal. I've been picking up some really good plug and play pieces. Plus the recruiting seems really, comparatively speaking, off the charts. Compared to what it has been over the last couple of years. Talk to us a little bit about what Buster Faulkner brings here. He was a quality control assistant at Georgia, and now he's sort of tasked with let's put this all together and make it happen. Talk to us about him.
So Buster was a key piece for Todd Monken at Georgia. He was sort of his left hand was Mike Bobo, and his right hand was Buster Faulkner. And Bobo's the offense coordinator now, and after he left for the NFL, and Buster took the Georgia Tech job. And Buster was an offensive coordinator at Southern Miss, Mississippi State. He has a track record, kind of a wide open spread guy. And his whole philosophy is just trying to get the ball into playmakers' hands and let them make plays, whether that's the wide receiver, the slot guys lining up in interesting formations. They could have 3 tight ends on the field. They could have no tight ends on the field. They're going to be very multiple, and they're going to be creative in how they line up. And even in the spring game, they showed a little bit of that with, playing 2 slots on the field and no outside receivers, just all kinds of different things. And, with the quarterbacks he has 2 guys that are very capable of being kind of veteran leaders, but are not going to wow you with their feet or wow you with their arm or anything like that. So their job is to deliver the ball and let their guys make plays, and that's what he's aiming for. The one thing I think that's going to really help him is they finally have experience and depth on the offensive line for the first time probably in 7 or 8 years of Georgia Tech, really going back into Paul Johnson's last really good season, which was maybe 16. So it's that's been maybe their biggest struggle, is trying to rebuild that offensive line, and they didn't come out of the gate strong there, and it's taken until about now to get it comfortable. And I think that's going to be the big thing that could swing their season. If that group can step up, I think they'll be able to find playmakers and make some things happen offensively.
I think sometimes we forget this team has had plenty of success over the years. You have a few bad years in any sport anymore, and you're fairly or unfairly relegated to the cellar, and that's particularly true in the ACC. let's get down to some X's and O's. And Will, you can take either offense, defense, or special teams, wherever you want to start. Let's dig in and get all those nuggets out of Kelly's head.
Yeah, so let's start at the quarterback position because we've talked about Haynes King obviously coming in, and I feel like on a national level he's already been kind of anointed as kind of the leader going in. But you mentioned Zach Pyron, someone who played 3 games last year. Obviously, Georgia Tech went through several quarterbacks just because they just could never stay healthy. But for people not familiar with Pyron, what does he bring to the table?
So he's sort of got the leadership piece, and the thing that's ironic about all of this is he's a year younger than Haynes King, was a higher rated recruit than Haynes King, was committed to Baylor, decided he wanted to be closer to home, decommitted from Baylor, committed to Georgia Tech. Pyron, if he doesn't get hurt, starts 6-7 games last year. He broke his clavicle in the Miami game when they were going in to tie that game, I think it was, and so the outside media seem to be very fixated on this idea that Texas A&M kid's going to come in and start. Zach Pyron was light years better than him in the spring. Haynes King's got to earn it. They're going to have a wide open competition in the fall, but I would be shocked right now if Haynes King was a starting quarterback against Louisville. I think that if Zach Pyron's healthy, he's the starting quarterback right now. And I think, Haynes has a lot of development left. He didn't feel like, I think he was developed by Jimbo Fisher at A&M, and he's starting at square one with a lot of stuff. So I think there's a learning curve for him in all of this, and I think Pyron's much more comfortable with the offense. He's improved his arm strength, which was probably the biggest knock on him, and he's throwing the ball a lot better, and he sort of has command of the locker room. So it'll be very fascinating to see how this all plays out next month.
So running back looks pretty interesting. Obviously, Dante Smith's back. Trey Cooley, somebody that came out of the transfer portal. Plus, you saw a guy, Jamie Felix, who got a lot of carries, going down the stretch. How do you see the running back position playing out?
If Dante's healthy, I think he's running back one out of the gate. He said he was 100%. My gut says he was not last year. That he was pretty banged up and struggled with that being healthy at times. He was trying to, I think, cover for himself a little bit and say he was okay. Trey Cooley steps into that role Hassan Hall had last year, where both former Louisville running backs kind of the counter punches. He's a little more of a big back. And then you have Jamie Felix, you mentioned. There's another kid, Evan Dickens, who signed and enrolled early from IMG Academy, who had a great spring. And if he continues developing, I wouldn't be shocked to see him and Jamie Felix play a lot this year too. Felix was a guy that was like a superstar recruit as a sophomore. He had an injury in high school, and that cooled his recruiting off. And that was sort of how Georgia Tech got him. And now he's getting healthier. He has tremendous potential as well. So I like their options there. I think they just got to get a little more production because it was down last year.
I think what fascinates me about the pass catchers is we talked about it at the beginning, all the different pieces that came out of the portal in addition to what those return. So what I'm gathering is there's just going to be a lot of competition for catches outside and at tight end.
Yeah, I think Malik Rutherford will step into that Nate McCollum role as sort of the big target at that slot spot. He stepped up in the North Carolina game and was big for them in that game and showed some flair with good hands. It's going to be interesting because Leo Blackburn may come back before the end of the season. He was projected to be, the number one wide receiver, tore his other ACL after tearing one 2 years ago. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see who else steps up. Obviously, I have Chase Lane. Dominic Blaylock's a guy that played really well at Georgia. When he was in there, he had some health issues early in his career. He's a guy who thinks he can play in the NFL, so he's got a lot to prove too. And Chase Lane was very reliable at A&M. They were just a horrible offensive team last year. So it's going to be, I'm real fascinated to see kind of who rises. The wild card guy there for me is a guy named DJ Moore, who redshirted last year because he got hurt. He's a really talented wide receiver from the Atlanta area, and I think he's got a chance to be special too.
I don't know if this bled through, but all of a sudden my Amazon Echo which is like a foot and a half away from me, just randomly went off in the middle of talking to you. So apologies if it did, but offensive line is probably the one spot where there's a little bit of continuity. Well, let's be real. It was just okay last year, but at the same time, they have, at least for the most part, some feel for playing for each other. So does that automatically mean that they're going to be better this year?
I mean, I think so. You have the whole left side of the lines back. Corey Robinson, who played last year as a redshirt freshman, had never played before transferring from Kansas. He started most of the games last year. You have Joe Fusel, who was a walk-on that went on to scholarship. He's maybe your left guard. Centers, Weston Franklin is back. Right guard could be a couple of different guys. They have a kid from Princeton. They have Paul Teo, who they brought in from Clemson, who's finally healthy. Jordan Williams probably plays right tackle right now, but he can play right guard. They actually have like 8 offensive linemen that I would say are like ACC level guys that could play on other teams. And that's literally the first time I've been able to say that since, 17, maybe like 2017. Like they just haven't had a lot of depth. So I think they've got a chance to be better. It's just going to be, you got to see it. And I think Jeep Wade was big there, the guy they brought in as offensive line coach from App State. He worked with Buster Faulkner before as his offensive line coach. He knows how to work with, as I put it, misfit toys, like not maybe like all American guys. And I think that's an important thing at a place like Georgia Tech, where maybe you have to be a little more creative and play guys who are undersized or maybe don't fit the NFL draft mode.
Let's flip over to defense, Kelly, and talk a little bit about that offensive line. They had issues last year stopping the run, but there are some transfers that are coming in. I think that will make a big difference, not only on the line, but also in other aspects of the defense. But let's start with the line and go from there.
So they were very good at defensive tackle and strong side end. The rush end position was a struggle last year. They had Keon White and Sylvain Yondergen at the field end spot and the strong side end, and they were great. That was 11 something sacks, like great season from those two guys. Sylvain will take over this year. They're bringing him to ACC kickoff. They clearly think he's a guy that's breakout guy. He's from Belgium. He's only been playing football for about 4 years, and he's really developed a lot in the last year. There were games where he outplayed Keon White, who was a mid-round draft pick. So that's good. The defensive tackle position is much deeper than it's been. Mekhi Scott and Daquan Dowse back at the D tackle spots. The big thing will be that rush end spot. Can they get something there? And then the linebackers cleaning up in the back end, which I talked about a little bit at the top. That run support from that group is going to be big, and finding some guys to make plays. The guy that's sort of my X factor guy there is a kid named Trinelius Tatum, who's played the last couple of years, but just kind of hadn't put it together, hadn't matured enough, wasn't putting weight on. He's done all of those things this past offseason, kind of got his life together. And I think he's poised for and going to be a guy who starts the back half of the season for them at that Mike linebacker spot. And he may jump these older kids before it's all said and done.
So in the backfield, we've got Brooks at safety. And one of the things that you have there, I think, are some big corners, but not familiar names to the general public. So, enlighten us a little bit about what people can expect from that secondary.
So they have 4 sort of starters for the safety nickel, 3-spot safety nickel. They have LaMiles Brooks, who was an all ACC guy. They have Clayton Powell-Lee, who was an all freshman ACC guy that came in off the bench after Jalen King got hurt in the Pitt game and broke his leg. Jalen King's back, who's a multi-year veteran guy for them that played a lot of snaps and has played a ton of football as like a 6th-year senior maybe, and was like a 4-star recruit and really talented guy. And then they have KJ Wallace, who came from Notre Dame. That was their nickel last year. Did a good job. Those 4 guys will play those 3 spots. The corner position's more of where the question lies. They lost Amari Walton to Ole Miss via the portal. He was he was a Paul Johnson player. Like he was a 6th-year guy. So he just, I think, wanted to go somewhere and have fun for his senior year and went to Ole Miss. Miles Sims back at the other corner spot. He was hurt in the spring, looked like not great spring game, just trying to go, but he's a tremendously talented, big physical corner that transferred from Michigan Jeff's first full year, I guess. And then the big question is the other corner spot. So they have Kenyatta Watson, who is a talented kid that transferred in from Texas their first year. Quinlan Johnson, who's a guy who's played a lot as sort of a backup corner. And then they brought in, they have Rod Shelley, who was a special teams guy, who played nickel, and a kid named Omar Daniels, who's from Kansas State as a transfer. So those four guys will sort of compete for that other corner spot, or maybe both if Miles is struggling. So they have bodies and they have guys that are not true freshmen. So I think they're in an okay spot. It's just going to be more of a matter of who's can kind of handle the workload and not give up big plays. And I think that's kind of where they're going to lean with that spot.
Let's take this defense as a whole now and compare it to last year and maybe even the year before, and talk about because you can do this. You see them up front, you get a good feel for what's going on. Let's talk about this progression. Obviously, from everything you're seeing here and everything that I read on paper says this is a much improved defense. Give us your perspective on what you think this team has done. Has it progressed? Is it staying pretty much the same on defense? Where is it?
I think it's two things. There were two principal issues. One was Jeff Collins was kind of meddling in the defense. And so they were making things overly complicated, especially in the back half of it with the secondary. They changed all of that a year ago, kind of made things simpler. And that made those guys turn it loose and play faster. And they made plays, they gave up plays, but that's the gamble. And no one's pitching, no one's playing 21-7 games anymore. Like, that's very uncommon. So you have to understand you got to score points to win. The big thing to me, the biggest change was the defensive line is able to get pressure on the quarterback. And that was the big step up from really 2021 to 2022 was they were able to get pressure consistently. They were able, 3 of the D-line spots were getting pressure out of the 4. Like, they were pretty consistent with that. They were commanding some double teams, and that was allowing them to squeeze the pocket, put a little pressure on the quarterback. And, it's why they played Clemson tough for the last 2 years, or, Pitt or some of these other games they got into. They were able to make quarterbacks uncomfortable. That's how they beat North Carolina twice. Like, just getting in there and mixing it up. And so I think, if they're able to continue to build pressure, I think that's going to be a big part of this defense is, don't make your corners have to cover somebody for too long. You can cover up for whatever's going on. You have good safeties, good nickel. Like, you can just cover the middle of the field. You have the one-on-one on the outside. And if you can squeeze the pocket on those passing plays, you'll be all right. And then if those guys are controlling the line of scrimmage, it should clean up a lot of your run issues too. And, push down some of the broken plays and some of the things you saw in the past that they were giving up in the run game that kind of got them, like against Ole Miss, for example. Getting away from that stuff, I think, would be big.
One of the things that I noticed today when, of course, this has been out for a little bit, but College Football News has Georgia Tech at the bottom of their rankings for ACC teams. I just think that is off base.
I'd say Virginia's the worst team in the league, and Virginia Tech's probably right next to them. And I went and I picked, for my subscribers asked me to pick like the ACC schedule. I went and printed out the grid and picked the whole thing. And I see Virginia winning like 2 games maybe. And I thought that about Duke last year, but they had Mike Elko, who's actually a good coach. I don't know if Tony Elliott's a good coach. I've seen nothing to make me think that he's some great football mind. I've always thought a lot of Mike Elko. I told Paul Johnson he should have hired him back in 2013 when he was looking for a defense coordinator when Mike Elko was a Bowling Green. Like, that's how long I followed that guy's career. But when you look at the ACC as a whole, generally they never pick it correctly, right? Duke, I think, was picked last year, and they won 9 games, like, and should have won 10. They should have beat Georgia Tech in Atlanta. So the way I look at it is the 2 worst teams are probably the 2 teams in Virginia. And then it'll be interesting to see like Wake, Syracuse, Georgia Tech. There's all these teams in this sort of middle ground. That'll be 6 beat Boston College. Like, I don't know where those teams fit. It all depends on like how their schedule plays out. I think Clemson and Florida State are probably the 2 big teams. And then I think after that, it's sort of a crapshoot of who you see. I might pick Pitt to finish fourth just because I think Narduzzi is a solid coach. And that's not going on anything other than him often not finding a way to lose games, right? And I think the league sort of is very top heavy, and then the rest of it's pretty average. So I would struggle to pick Georgia Tech to finish last, just based on what you saw, how they played with Brent Key over 8 games was drastically different. And you could argue that they have better personnel in a lot of spots now. So why would you pick them to finish last? So I don't think they'll finish last. I think what I've said is 4 to 8 wins, somewhere in that range is going to be how their season plays out. I just don't know where they fall in that.
I kind of felt like this was kind of a one-off based on everything I've seen preseason so far, that having Georgia Tech there at the bottom, like I said, it didn't make any sense to me based upon everything you've just laid out and that we're talking about. Will?
I mean, Georgia Tech beat UNC last year with the 3rd string quarterback, towards the end of the season. So,
and they played Georgia tough for 3 quarters with that same 3rd string quarterback.
Exactly. So this is why I think Georgia Tech won't be at the bottom of the league this year. But before we get into the schedule, let me ask you about special teams. I feel like this is actually a strong spot for the Yellow Jackets. I think just most importantly, they just don't want to use their punter 70 plus times over the course of the season. But even the kicking game, even though the kicker didn't kick a lot of field goals, he was still pretty accurate.
Yeah, Gavin Stewart did a good job. He did kickoffs and field goal. PAT was very solid. David Shanahan had tough breaks. Jeff Collins was coaching the punt coverage team / punt protection, and they had 4 punts blocked or something early in the season. And then they had a couple punt returns for touchdowns based on having to max protect for that guy. And now they've gone and fixed. They hired Ricky Brumfield, who was a really successful special teams coach. I think he's gone in and cleaned a lot of that stuff up. David's a guy from Ireland that hasn't played football for very long. So I think they'll be much better there. The bar's really low, let's be honest there. So if he's solid and Gavin Stewart does a decent job, I think they're in good shape there. And then they've always found decent return guys. That's something they'll work on. They have quite a few guys from the Jamie Felixes of the world and Dante Smiths who've done it, to newer guys like Christian Larry or Malik Rutherford or Jamal Haynes, a bunch of dudes that can return kicks and punts. So I feel pretty confident they'll be okay there. But I think it's going to be, I think they'll be very fundamentally sound. That would be the way I would put it.
You mentioned it earlier about Coach Key wanting to really work on, the recruiting aspect of the thing. And they have done a really good job so far. I think Rivals has them top 25. As of this point. Obviously, we're still 5 months from signing day, so anything could change. But can you explain how Georgia Tech's been able to recruit so well so far for the 24 class?
I think they have a good staff, a very solid staff. They have a very solid plan and a solid way of selling what they're trying to do. And they can offer playing time too. That's and opportunities. And they've played young guys, and the one thing they've done a nice job with is they've leaned on the expertise of the guys they have. So Ricky, who I mentioned that he worked at Virginia for Bronco Mendenhall. Ricky Brumfeld did a great job of recruiting New Orleans. So they have a bunch of kids from that area that are high profile kids that have committed because they like Ricky. There's there's all sorts of little pieces of this. So like Ricky's thing is, there's all these Hurricane Katrina refugees in Atlanta. So most of these kids from New Orleans will have family in the Atlanta area. So if they're going to go away and they're not going to go to LSU or go to Alabama or whatever, or maybe Florida State, Atlanta's a great spot for them because they have family and they have connections, and it's Atlanta. So it's a selling point to, a young student athlete. And then I think, they were just leaning on their connections within the state with the in-state kids. They have a few national kids. Marco Coleman's been a real revelation for them as a recruiter. They brought him back from Michigan State. He was a totally different guy than he was a year and a half ago when he left. I think getting away from being this former star player really helped him mature, working with Mel Tucker there. And he's hit the ground running recruiting. And so they've done a great job, and they've been realistic about where they're wasting their bullets in terms of like, we're going to press on these kids. And I think Jeff Collins spent a lot of time chasing his tail on some higher profile kids that maybe they weren't going to get or weren't going to stay with them long term. And I think Brent's been very, very upfront with these kids. Like, this is what we're doing. This is it. If you want in, cool. If you don't, then that's fine too. Like, I don't want you to lie to me about what you want to do. Like, you're either in or you're out.
So yeah, the opening game, I'm not going to go through every game, the first one, but we're obviously opening up on Friday night against Louisville, a team that, I like to question everything because there's, we're predicting things, but Louisville, yes, they're the hot team because they have an easy schedule, but at the same time, this is the first game of the season. They have a lot of newness on their roster, and I feel like if they live up to the hype, if there's a time to get them, it's right away when they don't necessarily have everything figured out.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back and look at how they played Clemson in the season opener a year ago, Georgia Tech, that was a neck and neck game. And if a couple of calls go their way, Georgia Tech's up 2 scores in that game against Clemson. So yeah, the first 2 weeks of the season, I think, are very wide open. That's when you can get a team that might be a little more physically more talented or have better, some physical superiority in certain positions or whatever it is. And I like Jeff Brom. I think he's a good coach. I also saw him lay some eggs at Purdue. So, I saw how bad their schedule was. I think I put them at like 8-9 wins, Louisville. But I think it's a toss-up game. I don't think it's a 9.5 point game. Now maybe it ends up being that, but like, I just think that game one, 2 new coaches, Brent's got a little more experience with his roster. I think it's going to be a lot harder game than people are expecting. And I think it should be a good game. And it's in Atlanta, so you'd think that, Georgia Tech would have a decent crowd and home field advantage playing in the Benz, but we'll see.
Yeah, week 2, South Carolina State, that should be a win. That don't need to get in that. At Ole Miss, they're probably going to be an underdog in. We know Ole Miss likes, they're a really good offense. Lane Kiffin can coach some offense. We know that. I'm very intrigued by the September 23rd game at Wake because I just don't know what to think of Wake. No Sam Hartman. They've lost a couple other players. And they're a team we just don't know a whole about. And I feel like this game is more winnable for Georgia Tech than in past years.
I think this is the game that I had circled as like the swing game, whether they go bowling or not, right? Like, if you beat Wake, they either need to beat Wake or of the season. I think if you lose those 2 games, you're in a lot of trouble. I think this is a very gettable Wake team. He's going to have ebbs and flows with his roster now with the portal and losing like Hartman, like you said. They've lost a lot of running backs, a lot of skill guys. They've had guys leave early. Like, they're not great defensively. I think that's a winnable game. If it was in Atlanta, I think I would feel more confident about Georgia Tech, but it's not walking into Death Valley to play at Wake Forest either. So, I think that's a really important game that they need to win to go have a postseason this year.
Yeah, last 2 games before the bye, they take on Bowling Green. That's at home. Again, they should be favored, but that won't necessarily be a gimme yet necessarily. And then October 7th at Miami, and then this is we saw how bad Miami was. Yes, and they made some changes, but at the same time, I hesitate because Miami woefully underachieved with a lot of talent. And yeah, I know they changed offensive coordinators, but what if Tyler Van Dyke is more like 2022 Tyler Van Dyke than 2021? I think that makes the game more winnable.
I mean, they should have beat them the last time they played down there. The game last year up here got out of hand after Zach Pyron got hurt, but it was a neck and neck game in the 3rd quarter. So yeah, I mean, Miami's basically been the biggest disappointment in the ACC since joining of any program over the last. They've been maybe the most disappointing program in college football for the last 20 years. Like, they just don't do anything and haven't won. It's all about what they used to do. And so, how quickly does that unwind if they start slow? Their schedule I think is pretty easy up front, but I just don't. I don't see it with Mario, and they're struggling to recruit a little bit, which is fascinating to me because that was supposed to be what Mario Cristobal is an expert at. He was going to go and win all those Miami kids over, and that's not happening. So, I think that if you look at all of that, I think, that's a toss-up game. If it were in Atlanta again, I'd probably feel a little bit better about it. Playing down in Miami, though, you don't know what you're going to get either, because half the time their fans don't show up. So that's a winnable game if you're playing well. If you don't play well, they'll put you away. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
All right, Jim, you want to take it home?
Yeah, anybody with complaints about what Kelly just said about Miami, you can send your comments to Ken at ajc.com. I'm sure he'll appreciate that. I couldn't help myself. He'll never speak with me again. Up next is Boston College, and that's again.
Who knows, man? Like, who knows?
Yeah.
They his AD wanted to fire him this past offseason, then Blake James,
wow,
and couldn't. And even though the guy had one down season, he had 2 good years and 1 bad one. I don't know they seem to be somewhat devoid of talent, but I think he's an okay coach. So I don't know what that is there.
Yeah. I'm not even going to try. Somewhere down the road, we'll get into that conversation with somebody else, but we'll just go on past this game. It's at home, which I think gives everything to Georgia Tech here. Now, this is the game that I really want to see for a variety of reasons. On October 28th, it's Tech takes on UNC. And you got to think there's some payback that somebody wants up there in Chapel Hill. But again, it's a home game. So they may be the Tar Heels may be riding into Atlanta to take another L.
I mean, it's the only team that Jeff Collins and Brent Key and Paul, all of them have winning. It's the only one they have all in common with a winning record against is North Carolina. It's sort of unbelievable how much Mac Brown's underachieved there. And I have friends on the staff there. And, I talk about Dave Doran as what did I call him something the other day? I said he's like a cockroach, right? He survives everything. He does enough to keep winning and keep his job. Mac Brown's doing a little bit worse than Dave Doran, and with way more money, more, support, a better staff somewhat on paper at some positions, tons of NFL talent. He's had 2 generational quarterbacks, and they can't get over 7 wins. It's unbelievable. And I don't know what to expect. That would be very funny if they beat Carolina yet again. I think they'd be pushing the league office to get them off the schedule, because I couldn't believe it the last 2 times they beat them. I thought they had 0 chance in hell of beating them last year in Chapel Hill, and went out and just controlled the game. So who knows? But you'd hope at some point for Mac, if he's sticking around, they'll at least start to show some signs of life. But my goodness, they have underachieved.
I don't think they have as much sway in the league office as they used to. Anyway, our next game here, me being snarky, is in Charlottesville at Scott Stadium, which is a danger zone for any team. But you're taking on Virginia, which is really having some problems with the rebuild. It's going a little slower maybe than people envision it. So thoughts here on what you've projected as being the bottom of the conference team.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a place Georgia Tech's historically struggled playing. They've had weird, very strange games up there. I watched them blow a lead a couple of years ago. Paul Johnson joked it was the only game he ever won as a head coach where he had a kick blocked, was up there. That's one of the 2 wins they have in 20 years up there. And they played every other year up there. They just have had terrible luck, but that team is so bad. I think Tony Elliott's in over his head. They seem to not have a lot of talent. I just have, and at that point in the season, they might be done. You know what I mean? They looked done quite a bit during last season, on the tail end of that season. So I just have a hard time imagining. I mean, Tony Elliott might be on the hot seat at that point. What does that look like? I don't know. And I don't feel like they're going to match up well in a physical game. I was never impressed with Tony Elliott as an offensive coordinator. Clemson, he was very pedestrian without a generational quarterback running his offense. And so, I was on a Clemson podcast the other day talking about this, but like, it's sort of amazing to me, like how far that he was trying to get the Georgia Tech job. They wouldn't even interview him. Like he's a little bit of, I don't know if it's smoke and mirrors, but there's doesn't seem to be anything there that makes me like get excited about Virginia football. And I think it's showing in their recruiting, the players they have, and the on the field product.
Interesting. Saturday, November 11th, big game, Georgia Tech, Clemson. That's going to be at Death Valley. So, okay.
I mean,
we'll just go on by that one.
I think that, with a real offensive coordinator and the weapons they have, Clemson should be pretty good. I think they maybe lose one game in the regular season next year or this coming season. So they were the team I would pick to win the ACC right now.
Pretty solid. They're a lot more solid at this point than they were 4 months ago. Mm-hmm. And it's scary how much more. It's really surprised me, but to me, this is a resurgent team, and I think everybody needs to get out of their way to some degree. Saturday, November 18th, it's Syracuse, and that's going to be a home game. So that's an advantage. That may be a good thing. Syracuse, again, that's one of those 50-50 sort of things. Who knows, right?
Which Syracuse are you getting? Are you getting the one that was pretty decent, or are you getting the one that sucks? And like they're very hot and cold, and it's they're one of those teams like Duke under Cutcliffe where they're thin. So as soon as they have like a key injury, like quarterback or whatever, they fall apart. And if they can stay healthy, they tend to do okay. Their schedule's a little wonky. This is sort of, I think, one of those make or break years for Dino, like whether he gets to keep his job or not long term. Who knows? I think in Atlanta, but I would give Georgia Tech the edge certainly in that game. Again, that's another team where I don't really see anything where I'm like, ooh, that's a big upgrade, or wow, they got that guy on their team, or they've got all these all ACC dudes, or there's none of that. It's just sort of meh. It's like them and Boston College are very similar that way.
Yep, I would agree. And that final game of the season, the big rivalry game, is going to be at Bobby Dodd, and it's Georgia coming to town. I think this time around you probably will have a fair amount of Georgia Tech fans in the stadium. So
yeah, I think it'll be a little bit less of a takeover. Given the way they played last year, Kirby Smart said that was probably the toughest anyone played them all year, other than in the playoff game against Ohio State. It's a tough game. They haven't beat Georgia and Atlanta in forever. Paul beat them a couple times in Athens, beat them 3 times in Athens, but never beat them in Atlanta. They haven't won since O'Leary in Atlanta. I was in high school the last time I think they won in Atlanta. So
not far back, huh?
Yeah, it goes back to
the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean it was 99, I guess maybe. So yeah, it's I guess it was a freshman in college, but it's been a long time, and it's a tough game. They're a monster right now, and they have so much talent that even if their offense steps back, it's going to be a hard game to win either way.
Mm-hmm. But it'll be an entertaining game nonetheless, because it is a big rivalry game.
Yep.
So anyway, a great look at Georgia Tech football with our special guest, Kelly Quinlan, who is the publisher and writer for Rivals and Yahoo Sports Networks, covering Georgia Tech, of course. Thank you, sir, so much for joining us, talking about the Ramblin' Wreck and getting some extra stuff thrown in there for good measure.
Me throwing shade at other ACC programs, inadvertently, yes.
Never any harm in doing that, man. Never any harm.